Hello, thank you everyone for joining us. We're here for the penultimate event in this fall's series, From Manuscript to Marketplace. The series is produced by the Authors Guild Foundation, which is the charitable and educational arm of the Authors Guild. Please visit our website if you're not familiar with what we do, and you're encouraged to join. From Manuscript to Marketplace is funded in part by the New York State Council on the Arts, so we thank them and all of our supporters. This series focuses on how a book was published and marketed, and it's been an interesting year for that, so there's plenty to talk about. We'll hear from the author and members of her publishing team on the story of the book and how it's gone during the pandemic, especially. So now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Jasmine Guillory, a lawyer, a graduate of Wellesley and Stanford Law, a Bay Area native who lives in Oakland. She's the New York Times bestselling author of The Wedding Date, The Proposal, The Wedding Party, and her book this year, Party of Two. Cindy Huang is vice president and editorial director at Berkeley. She joined Berkeley in 1994 and works with a roster of authors including Jane Ann Krentz, Helen Huang, Laurel K. Hamilton, Nalini Singh, Sylvia Day, Christine Fian, and Jasmine Guillory. Holly Root began her agency career in 2004, and she founded Root Literary in 2017. It's a bi-coastal agency that takes a career-focused approach, working closely with clients to build a body of work that endures. Her client list includes commercial and upmarket fiction for adults, teens, and kids, as well as select nonfiction. So again, we're here to talk about Party of Two. Thank you, Jasmine, Cindy, and Holly for joining us. And I'll turn it over to you to talk about the book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So Jasmine, do you want to kick off by just saying a little bit about Party of Two before we dive into the process part of this adventure?
Yeah, so Party of Two is my fifth book. It is about Olivia Monroe, who is a lawyer. She moves back to California from New York at the very beginning of the book. And at her hotel bar, she meets a charming stranger who she later discovers is a United States Senator. And he falls hard for her at the bar, and they have a little romance throughout the book.
So I feel like this is a very interesting one to talk about the difference between publishing a book this year versus in prior years, because Party of Two exists inside of what we like to call the Guillory verse, which are connected novels that can be read sort of as a series, but can also be read individually. You do not have to read them in a particular order, but they are all sort of linked. So can you speak to like what the biggest, given that parameter, what was the biggest difference to you in this book, bringing this book out in this year versus the experience of publishing previous books in the world?
I mean, everything was different in 2020. One thing, I thought you were actually going to say that it lives in a alternate version of 2020.
Oh, that is also true. That is also true.
And the funniest thing to me about this book is like when I was writing it, which was last year, and I finished it before the pandemic. I took so much I paid so much close attention to the timeline and the calendar, because I was like, all right, 2020, it's presidential election. Because he's a senator, like he's gonna have to be away at the convention and like at this and that. So I wanted to make sure the timeline totally worked. I looked all at like the Senate calendar, and then the book came out, and I was like, well, none of that mattered.
What's a calendar? What's time?
I know there's no such thing as a calendar in 2020. So that was one of the funniest things to me, and like I did all that work and then it did not matter.
I was thinking back about the process of sort of the early stages of this book, and again, it's a little bit different from like if this had been your debut novel, because we didn't have the same amount of lead time that you would normally, like the time from sale to publication of The Wedding Date, which was your first book, was so much longer because we're already sort of in this routine and we're running and publishing and running and publishing. But I was thinking about how when this book was coming in, we were all so like laser focused on the election, and we were like, that's going to be such a big thing, and it's going to suck all the air out of the room. We got to think about how we do this and how do we message that it does have this political character, but it's not an election book. It wasn't like we weren't trying to peg it to the election or anything. And then
none of that mattered either.
Those were not worries we really needed
Yeah.
to have spent time on.
Yeah. No, as a matter of fact, the difference was like, this is, yes, it is a political book, but it's a political book about someone who like cares about the world, as
Yes.
opposed to so many things going on right now. So yeah, so that was also a big difference. But actually going back to like when this book was first conceived, when we sold this book, I had written up a proposal for what Olivia was a character in The Wedding Date, my first book, a side character. She's the sister of the main character, and so I'd written up a like synopsis of what her book would be. And then I realized like last spring we had, we sold a number of books, in this same deal. And then last spring, Cindy and I were at a conference together, and I realized that we hadn't really talked about what the next book would be. Like, we sort of sold all these books, but we hadn't talked about who would be next in order, what the order was going to be. And so I asked Cindy, like, do you have a preference on that? And she said, just write whichever book you're most passionate about. And that's when I realized that I really wanted to write Olivia's book, but I did not want to write the book that I had written the proposal on. Like, I realized that I had asked that question because I was kind of dreading writing that book. And then I was like, well, but maybe you don't, because Cindy phrased it in that way, like the book you're most passionate about. I was like, well, I need to write a book that I'm passionate about, and it's not this. And so I just like, and I had an idea very early on, like when I was writing The Wedding Date, about writing a book with Olivia and like a politician character. But in that book, I had the idea that like Olivia was going to be in New York, and it was somebody in New York. And then I kind of rejected it because I was like, I don't want to write a book set in New York anyway. It'll be a different idea. She'll move back to California. It'll be totally different. And then I was like, well, but what if I wrote about her coming back to California and it was a senator? And so then I kind of wrote up the synopsis, and I remember Holly was on vacation, and then when she came back, I sent her an email like, surprise, what do you think about this idea instead? And then I was very grateful that Holly and Cindy were both like, yeah, sure, do it. Looking forward to reading it when you're done. So that was actually a good lesson for me in like what kind I need to be passionate about the book that I'm going to write, and I don't have to stick with an idea that I don't care about anymore.
Because honestly, Cindy, I don't know about you, but I was kind of like, what was this one supposed to be again? Yeah. This sounds great. Cool. Like, that's the nice thing about selling these sort of like, and books TBD, is that we just know we'll go along whatever ride you want to take us on.
Well, I think in the original, Jasmine, when I first spot you, I think Olivia was meant to be the second book in the contract. I think we decided to swap it with the book that ended up being the proposal it was because Carlos was such a great character.
Yeah. And then it was going to be the fourth book. And then I had the idea for Royal Holiday, and so then we pushed it. So we sort of kept pushing Olivia's book, and which I think was great because it gave me time to really figure that out. And I actually think I wouldn't have been ready to write the politician book like early on. I think I just needed more time to really figure out that like I could, I was early on, I was more shy about like putting my feelings about politics in a book. And then by this point I was like, well, I don't care. like after everything that we've gone through, because everything is going to be out there. And so that was also helpful for me to like have the time and like the growth as a writer to figure out what to put there and what not to, and how to link these characters together.
Yeah. That sort of jumps off of this sort of same idea of like pandemic times writing. And so you wrote this book, Party of Two, pre-pandemic.
Yes.
And then you've just written a new book, which will be your 2021 release during the pandemic. Yes. Do you have anything more substantial than a primal scream to offer about what that experience was like?
I think the only way that I wrote that book was that I gave myself complete permission to not do it. Like I think I sent Holly you an email like once a month,
Yeah.
saying, I am not turning this book in on time. And every time you were like, okay.
Yeah.
And so
Sure,
that
Jasmine.
it was, and it was like very helpful for me to just like release myself from that. Like, because when I first started thinking about writing it, I was like, I can't, because usually I have a schedule and I pay close attention to like word count, and I know when I want to finish a first draft by, because my first drafts are like always really messy, and then I go through a series of drafts before I send it in, and so that's how I usually do it. And I was like, I can't write on that time, like everything, especially in like, because I had plans to start writing it in like March and April. I mean, that was like those months I couldn't like think about anything. I remember I had a Zoom with some friends I hadn't seen in a while, and we talked about what we were doing. And these are people that I used to work with, and like one guy who's we had all shared an office like when we were baby lawyers, right? And he was the most like, he would always come in at the exact time, same time every morning, and leave at the exact time at night, like work really hard all day and then go home. And I was like, well, how's work going? And he was like, oh, it's good. I go to my home office and I work really hard all day, and then I go downstairs to hang out with my kids. How are you? And I was like, I mean, sometimes I take a shower. Like that was like, how do you get anything done? And so I think like, but then once I started writing, I just was like, I'm just gonna write something to keep me occupied all day, and we will see how it goes. I barely talked about it to anybody. I didn't give it any sort of title. I like when to even, and then once I sort of admitted to myself that like it was something, I still didn't talk about it to anybody. Like Cindy would occasionally send me emails about it, and I was like, nothing, I have nothing to talk about.
What
And
book?
that was also like really helpful for me to just make this like the thing that I was working on. And it wasn't a book, it was just a thing that I was working on. And then that like gave me the permission to finish it, because like I did not think I was going to turn it in on time at all until my deadline was in the middle of October. It really wasn't until September, like the middle of September, that I was like, okay, I think this is gonna happen. But it really wasn't until then. And I ended up, because usually I would have finished the first draft long before that. I finished the first draft like the last weekend of August, I think. And that was really the first time that I thought maybe I could turn it on time. But then I was like, I don't know. I usually need much more than like a month and a half to pull my messy first draft into something that's possible. But then by then, like, I think I took so much longer over the first draft, like in general. And I was like thinking about it. I mean, especially in August, because like August was also a terrible month, partly because like the pandemic, but also, I live in Northern California. There were fires the whole month. The air quality was so bad. Like usually, the first few months of the summer, at least, people were going outside, and I could like hang out outside with my friends. And I have a backyard, so we would like sit far away and talk. And then in August, like no one could go anywhere, and so that was like the thing that got me out of bed every morning in August, was like working on my book. And so I think I'd lived with it so long that it became a lot easier to like figure it out in September. But it was definitely the weirdest book writing. Also, this is the other thing, the entire first draft I wrote by hand.
What?
Yes, indeed.
Oh, that's bonkers. I had no idea.
Yes, I started it, because usually when I start a book, this is sort of my thing I do in my head to trick myself. Like, I feel like opening a blank Word document, especially when you want it to turn out to have like 90,000 words in it, totally stressful. So the first like few pages of a book, I usually write by hand, just so that like, then I open a blank Word document and then like type up what I've had, and then look at all those words I already have. So I started that, and then I just kept going. And so eventually I was like, okay, I should start typing this in. to my computer, because what if there's like a fire and I have to escape my apartment and can't grab the notebook in time? It's freaking out.
That would have been peak 2020.
So then I like started like typing it in kind of every day as I was like still writing by hand. But I usually have them around here, but I didn't bring them today. I have like the 2 large notebooks that I wrote the first draft in.
That's amazing.
That is awesome. I mean, the fact that you did it the entire way through too.
Yeah.
Did it help?
I always thought I was gonna stop, and then eventually I was like, I can't mess with something that's working, especially this year. So I'm just gonna keep going. But yes, I've never done it that way before.
Do you think you'll try this writing by hand again?
I hope not. It was kind of a nightmare. Also, my handwriting is not good. Like there were times when I was typing it in and I was like, what is that word? What was I thinking? And I had to sit there and like do like handwriting analysis on myself. Like, okay, is that a F or like, and look back at other words.
Oh, that's so funny.
But I mean, that it was working, so I did it. But that was and also, I mean, that also actually partly that helped me because I'm usually so like I give myself a word count deadline every day when I'm writing, and this time like I was writing by hand. I didn't know what my word count was, and that was also like helpful. But then there became a point where I was like, okay, but I don't know how many words I've written. So that might be useful for me to know, like, where am I? Because I mean, at this point I've written enough books that I kind of know where I should be generally. My first drafts are usually, actually this was a big difference. My first drafts are usually way too long. My books usually come out somewhere between 85 and 90 or so thousand words. My first drafts are always well over 100. I think the first draft of Party of Two was like 130,000 words. And then, but then it becomes like, because I usually write like a number of scenes kind of over and over again, and it becomes easy for me to cut like in the second draft. I kind of know what to do. This one, actually, the first draft was not as long as usual. Like it was over 100, but it was like 103,000 words, which surprised me at the end. But I think because like there was kind of a point in right around the middle of the book where I just suddenly got it. And I think that always happens in a book, but sometimes it comes late. I think Party of Two, I didn't get it until the second draft, which is why, or maybe kind of the end of the book, which is why the first draft was so big. But then this time, I think the second half of the sixth book, I don't think I cut really any scene as I was working through it. Like I trimmed stuff. I think I added some stuff, but that, when I went back and was editing, I cut stuff from the first half, but not really the second, because by that point, like I knew exactly what I was doing. But yes, the writing by hand was.
That's amazing. And this new book that you wrote in the middle of the pandemic is also, as Party of Two ended up being, contemporary fantasy, because there is no pandemic in this book.
Yes, I mean, I really had to, that was also part of the reason it was so hard to start writing anything at the beginning, because I was like, how do you write a contemporary book when this is what we're going through? Like, do I put this in, but I don't know how do you write a book? Like I write romances with happy endings. How do you write a book with a happy ending when we don't know when or how or this is going to end? And so I just had to like decide that I was going to write a book kind of in the after, more or less, at least in my own mind, because that was the only way I could like be hopeful and excited about what I was working on.
Yeah, it works. It's funny because I think especially for adult readers, I work in kids too, so there's other conversations being had there, but we've spent most of our lives not in a pandemic. And so there's something really comforting about reading something that is sort of back to normal, whatever normal means.
I mean, I am starting to see submissions now that feature the pandemic, and they're not fantasy, paranormal kinds of submissions. They're straight contemporaries. And it's really hard because we don't know what the end point is. And most of these books want to, concentrate on it. But it also has given me PTSD as
Mhm.
well, you know, because we all lived through it, and I don't necessarily want to relive some of those experiences. So, you know, I think a lot of writers are trying to figure out how to deal with a pandemic. And I would say very carefully, frankly,
Mhm.
because depending on what you're writing, it really may not be appropriate to really make it part of the world you're constructing in your books, even if it's a straight contemporary.
And
Yeah.
I think early
Mhm.
on I saw there were a number of writers were having conversations about this, like on social media, about what to do. And
Mhm.
I saw someone, I don't remember who it was, kind of make a comparison between this and September 11th. Because, you
Mhm.
know, it's not the same, obviously, but it's the same sort of like big thing that we all went
Mhm.
through. And how do you deal with it in writing? And one, you know, I remember someone said is like, you didn't see books that address that for years later
Mhm.
because people needed time to like
Mhm.
figure out how to deal with it themselves and then
Mhm.
write about it. And I'm sure there are people who could write about it early on very well. I'm sure there are people who are writing about the pandemic really well right now. I just knew that I couldn't. That like I needed a lot more space from it to really, you know, I needed to be over and then
Mhm.
and then have some space that we can figure out like how did we, you know, how did we deal with that? How did it work? But it also took me a while to be able to like figure out how to write anything and how to deal with it in my own mind, you know, as I'm writing. I mean, there were definitely some times like there was one point where in the next book where I wrote the scene with like a long tearful hug with a friend, and afterwards I was like, okay, that's what I was doing, all right.
Aw.
That's what it feels like.
Yeah.
I mean, why not be like, if you're gonna be the master of your whole world, like, why not puppeteer exactly what you are missing most,
Yeah,
right?
right. Yeah.
Oh man, it's such what a strange time. Yeah, and I think you're right. Like everybody just has to make their own sort of assessment of what's right for their world and their books and their characters, because we have all sort of been changed in these weird and unexpected ways by it. Do you have any advice, like just for people who are sort of at the front end of this, whether that's like putting a new book out on submission, trying to like get an agent, going out on submission to editors and publishers for the first time, or maybe like about to publish their first book? Is there anything, having done both, is there any like sort of life advice that you would offer up for people who are staring down this precipice?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, this is I mean, I think this was very helpful when I was doing those things, and I think it's even probably better now. But like, find something else to occupy
Mhm.
your mind with. Whether it's a lot of the advice that people give when like looking for an agent or out on submission is like to work on the next thing.
Mhm.
That did not work for me. That works for other people, and I think that's great if you can do that. I couldn't because I was too. First of all, I always need a break in between writing things. Like I can't jump to something new until I need to sort of refill my well. And so if you're like that, that's okay if you need a break. But also then like I was too distracted by the things that I was worried about to like focus on something new. And so, you know, find like either if it's like reading a bunch of other stuff or getting really into knitting or like cooking 1 million Christmas cookies, which is probably what I'm going to do this month. Like any of those things to like get yourself distracted about it because it can take a long time. Like there are always stories about people who get an agent, you know, a week after sending out their first query, and then you go on submission and then you immediately go to auction. That was not my like experience at all. So I don't like I'm excited for you if that happens, but I would not expect it. I mean, for me, it was like basically 5 months between sending my first batch of queries to signing with Holly, and then 6 months between like going on submission and getting the deal. So like these things can take a long time, which feels like, I mean, again, like there's no such thing as time this year. So that will either feel like it lasted 3 years for you or 2 weeks. Like that, who
Mhm.
knows what that means? But find something else to get yourself distracted about because you have no idea what it means and what's going on. Like I know I mean, all of the people like on the other side, like those agents reading your queries and like those editors reading your submissions, they're all as stressed right now as we are. You know, like they on the other side like have, you know, may have so many other things going on. Things might be super delayed, or they might go faster because that's their version of like distracting themselves. You don't know. So find something else to distract yourself with, because this is a long haul. And also, what I will say is, it is good practice for you to do that, because life in publishing is a lot of finding something else to distract yourself with while you're waiting for answers about X, Y, or Z. Like starting in 2015, when I first started querying this book, there's basically been no time in my life where I wasn't waiting for something. And so you just have to learn how to deal with that, because there are often like many months before you will get answers to, you know, before you'll get a contract or get answers about something or get this or that. Like it happens for everything. So, and again, sometimes it's really fast and sometimes it's not. So it's good practice to like learn how to best distract yourself, whether it's working on the next thing or whether it's like doing something that gets you completely away from any screen, so that you're not like constantly checking your email.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I remember you wrote your second book, The Proposal, you finished it well before the first book, Wedding Date, had come out. So that's not the case now.
Yeah.
But you know, but it definitely its time can be really elastic in publishing, and they can snap on you, depending on deadlines too. So
I think for me, the biggest thing about this pandemic has been that it has highlighted something that has always been true. I mean, I feel like that's the thing with the whole thing. All of our illusions of like control and like expectation, like all just ripped down. And that was always true before, but like it is in really stark relief now. But I think to me, the biggest thing has been that experience and outcome are not linked, that like things, because nothing this year has felt normal or expected or good, or like so many of the signposts of like this is working have not been accessible to us, and yet like books have continued to work. And so to me, that's been a very interesting severing of like what I'm experiencing is not necessarily predictive of like what the ultimate outcome will be. And I feel like that is another one of those like, oh, publishing forever, like good for me to know that. And you'd think it wouldn't have taken 17 years or however long for me to spark to that, but it really has been a year where like nothing, all of our preconceived notions of like how things ought to go, how things ought to feel, which were frankly very flexible to begin with, are like real at all, just all lies.
I mean, the first thing that went out the window for sure was publicity. You know, any kind of in-store events were the absolute first things to get canceled. You know, we're pulling authors off the road literally in the middle of tours and sending them home, and publicity had to really scramble to fill the void of how to still promote you know, a new book and a new author when, you know, at least half those venues were not open, literally. And it's been a real learning experience for everyone, and we're still learning.
Yeah, I mean,
sure.
Honestly, like all the respect to all the publicists and the bookstores out there who just like pivoted real fast to figuring out all of the technology, like all of, you know, the Crowdcast and Zoom and Instagram Live and whatever, like all of that stuff. Thank goodness for them. And it was funny because I did some event that I did in like April, right? Where everyone was still figuring out everything. And then I did another event in like July where we were all like, oh yes, obviously it's this or that. And it was the second event I did, the July event I did was like for Penguin Random House, and the tech people were all talking about how funny it was to see the huge contrast between how we were all at the beginning and then like how quickly everybody just figured it all out.
Yeah.
But yes, I'm so grateful for all, you know, the bookstores and the publicists who really just like jumped in and figure out how to do it. And I mean, yes, we're still all figuring it out, but it was very helpful just that like they all kind of very quickly seemed to be able to answer all those questions because we were all floundering.
I mean, Herculean effort on the part of publicists who had to go through and cancel like a year's
Yeah.
worth of work
Yeah.
and nobody knew. I mean, I was thinking the other day about like we pushed some stuff to fall, thinking like LA Times Book Festival moved to the fall because we were all like, because by the fall we'll have this sorted or not.
Not, yeah. By the fall, we'll all obviously be able to have a like 10,000 person event.
Sure, seems reasonable. That was not how that went. So yeah, it has been a year. I mean,
Actually, and that was, I remember because when I got that email about the LA Times Festival of Book pushing to fall, that was like the day before everything else fell apart, right? That was like the day before the NBA and all of that. And that was my first like, oh no, this is really gonna be bad when they decided to push it. And then I had no idea. Yeah.
It what a time. I mean, when we all are on the other side of it and can look back, if we actually have been able to form memories amongst all of the like just freak out, it will be really interesting to go through and like sort of decompress on all of that stuff. Man. There are a bunch of questions that we got beforehand, some of which kind of touch on some of these things. So do we want to just kind of jump in and like power through those?
Sure.
I have them sorted by kind of like stage of the process. So if that works for you guys, then we'll just go through that. So we had a couple questions that were kind of about like early stages and research, which were things like how to get a book published. So we can kind of walk through that real quick. And then some sort of more granular questions like how do I know what kind of publisher would want to publish my book? And related to that, sort of like how do you search for agents? So do we want to kind of just tackle those as a piece?
Yeah, I'll start with the searching for agents. I did that in kind of a number of different ways. The sort of great way to start off is to read the acknowledgement section of books that you think of as in the same category of yours. Because people always think they're agents in the acknowledgements, then you can sort of like start making a list of these are agents who like represent books that I like and that are in kind of my, if you think where would my book be in a bookstore, look in the acknowledgements of those books. And then, I started like just making a spreadsheet and throwing all those people in. And so like, here's the agent, this is the book that they represented. And then you can like expand that a little bit more and look at like what agency do they work at? Are there other agents at that agency who also represent that book? And by then you'll have a better idea of like what the agencies are out there. So then you'll see if you're searching, you'll see other agencies and think like, are those people I want to represent or I would want to represent me? What kind of books have they represented? And like look at that. I also found social media very helpful. Like if there are agents that you have put on your list, check on Twitter and see like what other agents are they frequently chatting with, because often people like chat on social media with people who like represent the same kind of things that they do. Look up those people. And so it's a process. Like what I found really useful was to work on that kind of in breaks as I was writing and not do it all at the end when I was like, I finished a book, now what? Because then it seems overwhelming. So like once I knew, okay, I'm writing something that I think I want to get an agent for, I would like, when I finished a draft, like do a round of research and like throw it all into a spreadsheet and then do another round of research a few weeks later. Because then it doesn't feel as like daunting and overwhelming to do it all at once. And then once I was like, okay, I'm getting ready to do this, then I kind of narrowed it down and did more specific research to figure out, sometimes people move agencies in between when you find them in something else. And so get all of their specific contact information, like all of that. But it's a bit, it's like any kind of big job search. Like you want to get all of the right information and figure out who these people are. Like these are people who are like going to be partners in your career with you, hopefully. And so you want to like really do your research on them before you start sending them your information.
Yeah. And I feel like you want to have, it's sort of like a wide net and a fine mesh at the same time. So fine mesh for people who are working with the caliber of publishers you want to work with, who are reputable, who are doing deals, who are moving their clients' careers forward, that stuff you want to be really picky about. But then I think it's great to cast sort of a wide net once you've narrowed down to like solid, reputable agents that you would be happy to work with. I think you can't, like, it doesn't hurt to try people because you don't always know what people are trying to expand into. So like a friend of mine who's heavily known for her suspense and thrillers has also started repping more rom-coms because in this moment in time, like that's bringing her a ton of joy. And she worked in romance years ago and kind of took a minute because the trends come and go and maybe they're not your thing, but like now she's getting back in. So I sort of feel like you can't always know from the outside every single thing that somebody would want, and you'll make yourself bananas if you try to, know every detail. And that's a really unfair burden to put on authors. So I'm sort of the opinion that like an email is free, like query widely within the confines of like reputable people who are going to do your work justice, because a bad agent is definitely worse than no agent.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And everything, Jasmine, that you recommended, you could apply to publishers too. A lot of authors mention their publisher, their editors in their acknowledgments, and that can be very useful in terms of finding out the right publisher who would be a good fit for your submission. I mean, obviously, agents are hugely helpful here. So if you do have an agent, I assume there'll be discussions between authors and their agents about which houses to approach. But if you're going to do this without an agent, and you can, it is possible, though it is in a lot of cases it can be easier with an agent because the agent already has those connections and networks, so they often can be the best source of finding out which editors would be the best fit for your projects. But if you're going to do this without an agent, then you need to find out who would be interested in the type of book that you're writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. And a lot of editors are on social media. A lot of them are on Twitter or Instagram. They're actually not that hard to find. They'll be quite upfront in their bios, and they often connect with the agents on social media as well. So it is easier now than it's been in the past to know who the editors are.
And then sort of the broad strokes, how to get a book published. I feel like we kind of touched on this, but I think there's a couple different paths you can take. We can certainly speak most to the sort of like traditional publishing path where like author writes manuscript, secures agent, agent submits manuscript to publisher, publisher acquires book. Like that is sort of the like broad path that we're mostly working on. But of course, there are as many different ways to do that as there are authors. I have people who are successful hybrid authors. So they self-published and then came up with something that felt like it was more of a fit for traditional publishing versus self-publishing. And the smartest self-publishers have just an incredible sense of who their readers are and where the markets are and which things are right for which place. That's a path that people take. Some people are purely self-publishing and maybe they have an agent who works on their subsidiary rights, or maybe they don't have an agent at all. So I think there's a lot of different ways that you can do that, and how you decide which path is right for you really has a lot to do with your goals as an author and how you want your book to meet its readers and where those readers are. So I think that's my sort of nutshell. If either of you have better versions of that, please feel free.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And one thing I do want to say, I think a lot of people think about some people think about self-publishing as like, if I'm querying agents and get a lot of no's, when do I give up and self-publish? And that is not the way to think about self-publishing. I think self-publishing is its own goal. And so you should figure out, is this something that I want to do and would be good at? Because I knew going in I would be terrible at it. And so that is not, a judgment on I think people do great jobs at self-publishing. I knew I wouldn't. And so I knew this is the path I wanted. But if you are the kind of person who who you think you'd be good at it, self-publishing should be your intended goal, not a if I've given up and do it that way. That's not, there are people who are great at self-publishing and that is the way that they want their career to be. And so really think about your career first, instead of thinking about self-publishing as a way to do it if one thing doesn't work or not.
Yeah, self-publishing is also a lot of work. I think people think it's it's easier. No, in a lot of cases it's harder because you have to do everything yourself,
right?
And you have to do all the research. So it's but it fits certain personalities really well, you know, in terms of, because it gives the author all the control. So it really is you really have to think about what kind of situation you want yourself to be in.
Those are very good answers. Let's see. So questions next about querying. You pretty much covered how to find an agent and the tips. How did you get your agent? I mean, I think you sent me a letter, sent me an email.
Yeah. Yes,
I read your book.
Also, I think one thing that helps though is like, The Wedding Day was not the first book I wrote. That was the first one that was published. Like I had, maybe it was like 4 years before, written a book and queried that one. And so that, like, I didn't get an agent with it, but it was a very helpful process because I knew how it all worked. And so I think it's helpful to just like, once you know that publication is the thing that you want, start paying a lot of attention to like how this whole process works. Start reading, lots of authors put like their query letters up on their website, or I put mine in a newsletter I sent once. Like, look for things like that, and just so that like you have a while of like seeing what the process is, listening to, you know, agents like will talk about their pet peeves on Twitter sometimes. Like, not everyone has the same ones, obviously, so don't like internalize all of that too much, but like start paying attention to a lot of that, because it's really helpful to like have some knowledge before you go into the process and think that it totally overwhelms you. I mean, all of publishing is overwhelming anyway. So you want to like give yourself a little basis in that.
Did I see that YA? Did you query me?
I think I sent it to Taylor and not you.
Oh, okay.
I think maybe you were on maternity leave.
With Dash, yeah, with my first son. And then we signed when I was on maternity leave with my second kid. I like called Jasmine from my front porch with a baby yelling inside because I just had to get in there. That's so funny. I had always wanted to ask you that and never remembered to. So there was something you said in there that was really sharp. About not over focusing on people's pet peeves. I think authors can really work themselves up about like how a query has to be. And to me, I think it's helpful to think about like the only job of a query is to make someone want to read the book. And if they don't want to read the book, then then the query has worked. A no is also a success because it is getting rid of people who don't connect with what you're doing. So yes, you want to make that letter as good as it can be, but it's also just like make people want to read the book. That is job one. And sometimes there's no like magic code. It's really just a matter of connecting with your people, and connecting with your people is a thing that's going to be repeated throughout the publishing process. So sometimes that helps, I think, to make querying feel less scary, or less random. I think sometimes it can feel really, why am I doing this? Like, this is not the same skill set. And that's true. And if authors were amazing at query writing, like I would have less to do, although I do regularly steal from my authors when they crush it in their queries for my pitch letters. But like we write queries all the time. We send pitch letters with manuscripts when they go to editors. And sometimes there's this fun chain that happens where a great line from a query ends up in my pitch, ends up on the back cover copy. And that's one of my very favorite, like querying does make sense. Here's how it works in context kind of stories.
Well, it was also funny because, you know, I guess just this week, again, time has no meaning, we were figuring out the cover copy for the next book. And it was funny because it was like, yes, this is exactly what writing a query is like, you know, trying to figure out what in these like 200 words, basically, what will make someone want to read this book. So it does, like, there's a lot of stuff about the querying process where you sort of feel like, why am I doing it this way? This makes no sense. I will never have to do this again. And that's not true. Like all of it will be repeated over and over again in your publishing career, which is both depressing and a little helpful, like gratifying. Like, okay, this was a skill, but it was helpful to learn.
Yes, nothing is wasted.
Yeah. A good pitch is a good pitch.
Yeah,
for sure.
This kind of
and
is
you have to pitch yourself over and over and over in a publishing career.
Yes. This is sort of a little bit of a like specific question, but I think I can make it broader. The question was how do you recommend querying books that have both elements of women's fiction and romance? But I think we can extrapolate that out to anything that's kind of like has a foot in both worlds.
Yeah, I think I mean, first of all, like, look at agents who represent both. That is one thing, but also, you know, and like emphasize like a little element of both things. Because anyone who, like, I think marketing terms in publishing are very wishy-washy, and so it's not like there's a hard line that comes in between one or the other. A lot of people will say they represent one or represent both, and vice versa. And sometimes people go a lot farther to one end or another, but most of the time there's a lot of meeting in the middle. So that's not something that I would worry too much about. Just to like sell your book in the best possible way, and then it'll all sort of come out in a wash.
Mhm.
Yeah, that tracks. And then there's a quick I'm going to squish a couple together. There was a question about from the nonfiction side of things, does a brand new author have a chance of landing with a good sized publisher if they have a huge social media following? And then there was also one about sort of like, do you have to have, like, what kind of platform do you have to have? And I can tell you from my perspective as like seeing sort of that first input, there are a couple of different ways that you can market. Platform is a bigger deal for nonfiction, where you need to be authoritative and already somebody that people are going to for answers to a certain thing. Fiction, there's people just typing away at their farm in Idaho and like getting book deals with, no social media presence whatsoever. There's other people whose social media presence makes it a lot easier to just sort of attract a large audience. That's really all that those presences are about, is about sort of recruiting your reader, finding your reader, but not every book is going to have that social media piece. So I think you kind of, for nonfiction specifically, you either sort of need to be an expert whose qualifications make you authoritative, or you prove your authority by people already coming to you and knowing who you are. Cindy, do you have anything else that you would say to that sort of like platformy stuff?
I think that's definitely correct. And I think people use social media as a gauge for your comfort level too, because social media is a form of promotion for publishers. So you don't have to be an expert or have huge followings on every platform, but we do ask that you participate somewhat, in, especially now when when social media has become a really necessary tool for book promotion, that you feel comfortable participating in it. So because we want to build your own platform, and we want to encourage engagement for authors directly with their readers too. So publishers will help you with that. But and an author having not a huge platform or a huge social media presence to begin with isn't a deterrent necessarily for a deal to happen. But during the course of publication, publishers will ask you to step it up probably. So you're going to have to.
You don't have to be everywhere, but you kind of have to like pick a thing that you're good at. Like if you don't understand what TikTok is, fine. If Facebook is where your readers are, and again, I think it's a lot about who your reader is and finding them and connecting with them where they are. For certain categories, you're likely to get a better response on one or the other of the platforms. So you don't have to be, 1,000 people in each of 17 is not as helpful as sort of like focusing in and figuring out where you can manage to be, where you can stand to live online.
Yes.
All right. So some actually really interesting publishing process questions over here that we'll try to kind of power through. Do you find the 6-month lead time still essential? I'm going to let Cindy take that.
Yeah, I saw the question, and if you mean in terms of from acquisition to publication, 6 months is actually really short. That's a crash. That is actually a crash project. The typical lead time now is more like 18 to 12 months from acquisition to publication. For Jasmine, that was more like the 18 to 2 years. It felt like.
Yeah. We got the deal in October of 2016, and the book came out in January of 2018 for the wedding.
Yeah, so it was over a year. I mean, it wasn't 18 months quite, but it felt like it for sure. But that's more typical, in terms of, especially now, I think, because publishers want to be really careful about having room to promote, authors as well very successfully. And in terms of stores, making sure that they have literally enough room. A lot
Mhm.
of it is sold online, but it's physical as well.
And a logistical question that we didn't even touch on for Party of Two, but like,
Mhm.
especially right now, just literally printing books
Yes.
Mhm.
takes a long time.
Yeah.
Like, there's so many books
Mhm.
this year
Mhm.
that, like went out of print or had like long printing delays
Mhm.
because the pandemic has really thrown a wrench into a lot of book production, which
Yeah.
I think a lot of people don't recognize. Like,
Yeah.
they sort of think of the word part of the book, and then it goes off to a magical land and
Yeah.
gets printed. Like, that's
Yeah.
what I thought. And then, like, Party of Two had a bunch of like hiccups
Mhm.
in
Yep.
the print
Mhm.
process.
Yeah.
And,
And
and that was actually the easier one. Like, I
yeah.
know so many cookbooks who have been super
Mhm.
delayed
Mhm.
because those
Mhm.
are full color and like those
Mhm.
are much more complicated. So
Yeah.
there, like, that needs a lot of lead time too.
Yeah, there's been a lot of printing issues this year that were compounded, but the printing issues existed
Gray
before the
hair.
pandemic. Yeah.
I have a whole patch of gray hair directly attributable to printing issues.
Yeah. And yeah, I think we all have definitely started sprouting gray hairs because that talk about not being in your control.
Right.
That was really, it's been really scary actually, because a lot of publishers have had to adjust printing schedules because, in terms of publishing schedules, books that were supposed to otherwise would have been out when they were scheduled for had to be pushed away months because there was literally no room at the printer.
Mhm.
And that's really scary. And then I know people were trying to find very creative ways of printing. I know most of Obama's book was printed in Europe,
Yeah,
which is
there was
not
a
the
whole
norm.
article about like his book got sent over on like ships from Germany. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was the only way to ensure that the books were printed in time. That's a little scary.
For
So
all that we're like a very
Mhm.
modern industry in many ways, and people are like, but ebooks. And I'm like, yeah, print's not going anywhere. And at the
Mhm.
end of the day, like, we're a shipping and logistics business as much as we're a creative business. And people forget that, but you
Mhm.
forget it until it jumps up and bites you.
Yeah.
And then you are reminded.
Yeah. And even when the books get printed, there's been so many distribution issues with
Mhm.
getting books from the retailers, their own warehouses, to, their distribution centers. So we've had slowdowns all through the supply chain for stuff that is literally in no one's control. It just
Mhm.
feels like bad luck upon bad luck a lot of times. Mhm.
I think that we've kind of covered the question of how can I speed up the submission process with a giant ha.
Yeah.
If we knew that, we would be
Yeah,
really
that's
rich.
the answer.
Um, there was a very interesting question I thought about. How did the pros and cons and or necessity of writing series in this genre? I would love to hear you say a little bit about that, Jasmine, because I know that's something
Yeah,
you did.
that was at the beginning. That was more or less accidental, I will say. Like, I didn't, when I, wrote The Wedding Date, I had an idea I had some kind of general ideas for a few other books. As we talked about, I had like an idea for Olivia. The only real idea I had was for what ended up being the third book, The Wedding Party. And so it was funny because when I talked to agents, I ended up like talking to 3 different agents, and they were all like, so you're gonna write a book about Carlos, who's a character in Wedding Date? And I was like, oh, well, I mean, I like Carlos, but actually, my next idea was this. And they were all like, yeah, that's a good idea. Also, you should think about an idea for Carlos. And so I kind of thought about that, but I didn't really have one. And then a few months before we got the deal for The Wedding Date, like, that's when I got the idea for the proposal, which ended up being the second book. And so then, I sort of had the idea for the first 3 books, but I had planned for The Wedding Party to like be the end of that, these books. And then that's just not kind of how it happened. Like, I just sort of kept doing it. So for me, I wasn't really thinking about it as a necessity or any of that. It was just like I had ideas from characters that I was really interested in, or I had fun writing this one and kind of had an idea for what came next. I do think in this kind of in this marketplace, like readers do like series, and so I think that does help hook a reader a little bit. But it also is not a necessity. There are a lot of very successful writers who don't do that at all. So it just sort of depends on what calls you and like what you want to write about.
Yeah. And there was a interesting and good question I thought about. What was the thing you did for marketing that was the best move you've made? And then we can kind of transition into the marketing and publicity part of all this too.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like a lot of stuff about books is like throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks. I have no real idea. I think the most important advice I have to give for people doing any marketing publicity stuff is like figure out what you both are, what you're good at and what you enjoy doing, and then concentrate on that. Because if it's like, and that also is like for the social media piece too, like if this isn't something that you like hate doing or that feels unnatural to you, it will be clear in the way that you do it, and you'll like resent that. So there's so many different ways that you can concentrate yourself. So do it in the stuff that like feels right to you and that is fun. Like like the ways, there's so many different kinds of social media. Do the things that like you have fun with, because then it's clear to people following you that she's having fun with this. But there's no like, if I knew what what the special marketing thing was, but I really have no idea.
Yeah, I think the thing with marketing is it's so many touches and they all stack up to make a success. And it's rare that we ever have like one specific thing that we're like, that did it. Like that is the thing. You can kind of sometimes tell what the tipping point was, but yeah. And especially for you, I think because we're working in sort of an established series, it's a very different set of levers than at the beginning, because now you have readers and we're just trying to remind them that you have a new book coming versus sort of like recruiting readers. Yeah. Which leads me to a question from a debut author that I want to give this author a hug first off, who said, as a debut this year, I'm wondering how much sales push I've lost with the absence of live book events. And I want Jasmine to talk a little bit about like the event thing, but I just want to say from like my agent heart that feels for you so much, one of the like hardest, worst things about this has been like the idea of like what it could have been, the like ghost of your publication loitering in the background. And I think as much as it's possible to release that ghost, to like thank it for being with you on the journey and letting it go, because there is no way of knowing. There's absolutely no way of knowing what it would have been, because this is the year we have, and it is what it is. I mean, practically speaking, I have found that the biggest issue has been like the physical store stuff more so than events. Like, I don't know that events have been as much the driver as like closures and stock, and like all of the discoverability has been a bear. If you're new, especially, it's been really hard. And it's been really hard for everyone. So you are super not alone. Amazing books came out this year that just didn't quite get the fair shake. But stores, because you're not alone, everybody knows. Like, no one is going to look back on sales from 2020 and be like, oh, I guess nobody cared. Like, we're all going to remember what happened in 2020. And I think people are looking at, ordering things in for paperback, or libraries who were closed and couldn't bring in new books in the spring. Like, they all know. And I think there's so much goodwill and like a desire to help people who've been in that situation. So, dear debut, hang in there. And you are super not alone.
Yeah, I mean, right. I feel so bad for debut authors this year. And also like I have no idea what sales numbers would have been if this year hadn't been what it was. Also because it's not, I can't really compare it to any of my other two books, because of the way my career has gone. It's been this book sold more in the first month than any of my other books did, but that is because it's my fifth book and I have more readers now and all of that. So I don't like, if it would have been sold even more if there had been a pandemic, I don't know. Like maybe it would have sold less because people were craving like fun, happy stories, or maybe it would have sold more because there would have been bookstores. Like Yes, it is really hard to try to figure out what would have happened in a Alien 2020. But I feel really bad for debut authors this year. I think booksellers, like I saw Emma Straub, who is an author and a bookstore owner, saying something on social media about how she's like trying really hard to pay attention to those, especially those spring 2020 releases, like the March and April and May ones, that really got lost in the shuffle. I think by the time summer hit, people were like paying more attention to new stuff, partly because like we already knew there was a pandemic. Like that news wasn't in the top every day. And so I think, booksellers are really trying to pay attention to that for like paperback releases and for next year, and to put, I've seen some bookstores, like when they reopen, have tables that are like books you may have missed in 2020. Which is really nice. Like, because I think bookstores really care about that too. Like there were books that they fell in love with because they read the galleys in like December and were like, we can't wait to hand sell this book. And then they did not get to do it. So I think bookstores are really rooting for you too, if that helps at all.
Yeah, and banding together, there's some questions about sort of like publicity and marketing and some of those things. And I think that one of the cool opportunities right now is to sort of like lock arms in solidarity with other authors, because you're not really competing even in normal times. Like books are their own things, and what people spark to in each one is really different and individualized. So the more that you sort of like have this solidarity with your fellow authors, and this moment in time, I think is such a great opportunity for that, to sort of like get together with a bunch of people from your pub month and be like, 2020 y'all, or the whole year. I mean, I think we're seeing this with some of the debut groups. Like on the YA side, there's a lot of like debut classes and groups, but sort of banding together and finding ways to help promote each other, because it all helps everybody.
Yeah. I mean, there is very few silver linings this year, I mean, obviously, but one of them unexpectedly has been books staying in stores on the shelf longer, and the books that were in there at the start of the pandemic stayed there like the entire time, because stores, when they had to shut down, they had those books in place. So I mean, it's not much of a silver lining, but it's a little bit. I mean, we're grasping at I am at least at straws, I know, but you really just have to take it on the chin. Everyone has had to do that this year. So
there's some questions here about like learning the publicity ropes. Also points to whoever sent this in, because they asked not marketing. Kudos to you for knowing the difference between marketing and publicity.
First of all, it took me like at least 3 years of doing this to learn the difference. So yeah, I think after we do this one, we'll have Johnny come back and do some live.
Yeah. So do you want to speak to anything about sort of like the difference between marketing and publicity that you've experienced, Jasmine?
I mean, I learned what the difference was, but honestly, on the author side, there isn't much of a difference in the way you deal with it, because like that difference is really on your publisher side for the most part, like on my publisher side and what they do. And like the way I handle it is the same on both sides, which is like try to, I mean, again, I think back to what I said, like try to figure out what your strengths are and what you're good at, and then what you like in what you enjoy doing about the process. Like I've always enjoyed doing events. I knew I was going to enjoy that at the outset, and I like lobbied hard to get to do as many events as possible, because I knew that like I would enjoy that part of it. Obviously with the pandemic, it's all different, but these are things, but like there are authors who hate events and like who don't like talking in front of people and who are shy about that. That's okay. Like figure out what you like and where your limits are. Maybe you want to do a lot of like essays to promote your book because like that's the kind of thing you like. Pitch yourself, like talk to your publishing team about it. I think the most important thing is to really like loop your publishing team into all the stuff you want to do, and then pitch yourself, talk to other authors. I think I've gotten the best advice from like talking to other authors, and not just like talk to other authors in your genre, obviously, but like other authors who are doing the kind of thing that you would enjoy doing, or that kind of way, because that's like the best way to figure out how to do it. Like all of, pay attention. I think that's the biggest thing. Like look on, follow people on social media, see what they're doing, think like, would I like doing that? If so, try to figure out how to do it, and like that, I think that's really the key thing, is that there's no real guidebook on how to do this, and there's no like right or wrong. Some people enjoy this and some people don't, and you don't have to do either of those things. You just have to figure out what's best for you in your career, and like what works most for you as a person and as an author. You may try things early on and be like, yeah, this is not fun, I don't want to do it, and that's fine. But really just kind of figure out what the best way is for you to work.
Good answer. Johnny, you want to chuck us some live questions?
Hi, sure. Yes, we've got a lot of great questions. So we talked about debut authors. Someone else asked about kind of getting back into things. She said she published a trilogy, but is no longer with that publisher. But she's now written the prequel to that trilogy, but is having a hard time finding an agent or publisher. So she feels like she's back at square one and is looking for suggestions. And somebody else said they feel like they're in a similar position. They last published a novel 18 years ago. So do you have advice for somebody kind of restarting things?
I mean, so the prequel thing is probably because when you publish new entries in a series, a lot of, like, every time you bring out a new one, it boosts book one. That is like the tried and true math of series publishing. And so to take that prequel to another publisher is another publisher working in a way that is likely going to benefit book one. And that's just hard. And it narrows the field of options. And so for agents, we don't get paid until we sell something. And so for us to take something on, we want to have the widest possible pool of ways to get paid. And so I think that's probably what's informing some of that difficulty. If there's a way to sort of respin it as a standalone project so that it, has an Easter egg for people who loved the first series, but is its own thing, I think that's a possibility. Oftentimes when you see a series move, it's because an author is following an editor, or there's other sort of reasons for that kind of shift to have happened. But when you're coming at it from an author-driven side rather than the publisher driving that boat or asking for that, then I think you sometimes just have to be a little bit creative and bordering on sneaky in terms of making it super accessible to bring you that new readership. And I think for people who've been out for a while, that happens. It happens all the time. And getting back in is often just a function of like opening yourself up to who you've become in that intervening time, and not sort of fixating on like what you were writing before and what was working before, because the world has moved and so have you. And I think one of the biggest gifts you can give yourself is permission to have grown as a human, as a writer, as just, in the world, and to give yourself space to write what you want to write now. And also spending time familiarizing yourself with, if you're in a genre, that the expectations of the readership can really shift as trends come and go. So like what's hot right now in science fiction, fantasy, or in romance or mystery or whatever, those trends will have shifted kind of what the reader expectation is. But, if you've been a reader throughout, then that should feel pretty familiar. But I think it's just diving in and writing the strongest new thing.
Completely agree with Holly.
Someone says they keep hearing about authors keeping one foot in the traditional publishing realm and the other in hybrid and indie. Could you talk more about that, and how does the indie part of it work for the author and agent relationship?
So I can say for my authors who do both, I don't commission their self-published works because I don't represent them in the same way. For some of them, I do subrights. Not every book is going to have a subrights application. So that's things like audio, foreign, film, and TV. And not all of those are going to be applicable to every project. Some things that are really hot here don't travel, like cowboys, God love them. There's not a huge market for those internationally. And so that's like that's not so much a self-publishing category, but that's, that informs our choices. So I mostly just try to keep those lines of communication really open, and my authors do a great job letting me know what they've got in the pipeline, and we make sure that their publishers know what's going on. So really it's just case by case. It's not, Mostly, I don't do a ton of prospecting for that. Like there's some agents who really hyper focus on like looking in hybrid spaces for people that they think like there's an opportunity there to make them hybrid, to take them from indie publishing into sort of that hybrid model. That is not something I've done a ton of recently. So mostly it's my existing authors who are kind of like, hey, I have this thing. I feel like the readers are on KU, or it's a self-pub kind of thing. And I'm like, yes, great, have fun, go with God. So that's kind of how I do it. But I think it's different agent to agent.
I will say that for a lot of authors who are considering being hybrid, to keep in mind that oftentimes it's two separate audiences who are buying your books. Traditional print audience is separate from, this will be primarily ebook audience for the indie published books. So pricing is usually different, packaging is different. Don't expect the same experience or same readers, frankly, because I have had a fair amount of experience trying to bring over best-selling indie published authors into the traditional publishing sphere. It had a lot of failures, frankly, because those readers did not follow the author. Partly is a price point issue, partly is because they think the book will be different because it's being published by a publisher and there are too many people now touching that book and it's not a pure expression of the author. I have heard this, yes. And they don't trust it. Yeah. So, so just keep in mind, you can be both and do both successfully, but it's not usually with the same book, in terms of you keep in mind that you'll be appealing to there will be overlap. Obviously, there'll be readers who hopefully love you enough, they'll buy everything, but not everyone will.
A few people asked about the editor relationship. Someone asked, first of all, if Berkeley has guidelines for genre fiction, such as romance and mystery. Someone else asked, how can one go about finding an appropriate editor and approaching them directly?
We don't have guidelines per se. I will say that the best thing to do is to read our books, and those will tell you, in terms of, even though we don't have guidelines, you'll notice like our category mysteries that we publish in Prime Crime are usually generally a certain word length. They're usually on the shorter side. Our romances are generally like that 80 to 100, but those aren't really hard and fast rules. Those are it just happens to be the way a lot of, people write. So there isn't, partly because we're not operating a specific line. There isn't a requirement, for instance, for a type of character or type of plot in most of what we do. So we don't have guidelines that way, not the same way like Harlequin would have guidelines for their specific category lines. In terms of finding an editor, I think it does. I think it a lot of the stuff that we had talked about earlier in terms of a lot of editors are on social media. It's, a lot of editors are mentioned in acknowledgements of the books. If you've never read them, you definitely should, the acknowledgements part, because you can find out a lot actually of information that way, not just about the publisher, but about the author, the research. A lot of people like to put in little tidbits in the acknowledgements that just gives you a bigger sense of the overall picture. So, conferences are really good when we used to have them, in terms of they're virtual now. So it's, but they're still happening. But in the past writers conferences, a lot of editors and agents attend them as well. So networks, professional organizations like, obviously Authors Guild, most of the other genres have professional organizations too. Some of them are in the process of re-identifying themselves, shall we say, and working with their membership. But joining some of those professional organizations can really help you connect with other professionals in the business.
And I think one thing that I haven't said, but I think it's important, like for this whole conversation, is if you want to get published, read a lot in your genre. I think that is like one huge thing that a lot of people don't do, that always surprises me that people don't do. Like, that is the biggest advice that I could give anyone who wants to get published in anything. Like, if you want to write picture books, read hundreds of picture books a year. Like if you want to write romance, read a ton of romance. If you want to write mysteries, read a ton of mysteries. Like in a bunch of different publishers across like categories and like all of that. because that is in recent ones, like not, you know, not things written when you were growing up or 15 years ago or whatever. Like read things that are coming out now and within the past 5 years, because that will tell you so much about the industry and so much about expectations. And, you know, even maybe there are some like unwritten rules, but those are all, unwritten rules are always kind of moving. So you'll see that as you read and as you change. Like I, you know, even reading, because like as we talked about briefly earlier, like the first book that I wrote and queried was young adult. I wrote that, I guess, probably like 10 years ago. If I wrote a young adult now, it would be very different, like, because the life in young adult has changed a lot in those years. So I think pay attention to what is going on in the genre, in the category that you want to write in, because that really affects what you write and what will get published.
And I think you can hold loosely to some of that knowledge. Like I would encourage you to not hyperfixate too much, because like one of the things that agents do is we know people's tastes, but then we also know people's working styles. And so I take it really as a personal challenge to like match make people who will not like actively make each other crazy, who will work well together, who will have like who will speak each other's language and be able to make beautiful books. So that's a big part of what the agent does as well. So one thing I always ask authors to get at that question, I mean, if they have specific editors that they're like, I have read 15 books that Cindy edited this year and I loved all of them, and I'm like, great, we are definitely going to Cindy. But I will ask that question other ways too. Like Jasmine, when we talked, I remember saying like, who do you love? Like, whose career do you love? Like, whose books are you like, that's an auto buy? And a couple of the books that you named were Berkeley books. And so that made it really easy to, I mean, not that I would have sent out this romance and not sent it to Berkeley, but it made it really easy to make sure that, you know, I prioritized that because that's where her tastes were. And so that suggested that that was going to be a good match. So that's something we're also like working on from the agent side too.
Have you used the same editor for each book, Jasmine?
Yes, Cindy has been my editor since day one.
That's lovely. A couple of lawyers had questions for you, Jasmine. Do you maintain your license? Do you ever plan to go back? And also, how do you turn off the lawyer brain when you're rewriting and editing?
So I am inactive now. I'm a full-time writer now. I do pay money to the State Bar of California every year to maintain my inactive license, however, because I am a risk-averse lawyer. so, so that is the thing every year that I pay. You know, I think for me, because I wrote my first 3 books while I was still practicing. So for me, the most important thing was to try to take distance between the workday and writing, which obviously now during a pandemic is a lot harder because there's no real end to a workday, or you're working in the same space, you know. But I would like, I know people who can, you know, take breaks during the day, back when people went to an office, who would like take breaks during the day at the office and like work on their book. I never did that. Like I would only ever, sometimes I would like write at lunch, but I would bring my laptop to work, go to the Starbucks across the street and like write for 30 minutes at lunch. When I came home from work, I would like change clothes, make dinner, take a break, and then write, because I needed that like mental distance from it to sort of turn myself from like the lawyer to the writer, because I think, and also you just need breaks, but like I needed to have that like physical and mental distance in order to take that, you know, pull that part away from me. I will say, I mean, I think part of the reason that my first drafts are always really long is that I feel the need to over explain everything as a lawyer would. So like I'll give very specific driving directions to a place, and or like explain, well, the reason that they did blah 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 is because, and like go into like footnote level detail. And then in the second draft, I'm like, nobody else cares about that, Jasmine, and I can like cut it and change a, you know, page into a sentence. So that is like, I think the most helpful thing is like indulging, at least for me, was indulging that in the first draft and like let yourself do it, because otherwise I will mentally fuss about it. And then in the second draft, I'm like, okay, I can cut that a lot. So people do it in different ways, but that's how it's worked best for me.
Someone asked if you don't mind, if you'd like to address being a very successful author of color in the romance sphere. Is that something you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it has been really gratifying to see the great reception for my books and for, so many books of authors of color. I think it has been also great for publishers to see that. It is, I've seen a big change in the industry. I send my queries out in 2015, and so there's been a big change, and like in the 5 years since then, I see so many more books on bookstore shelves, like, and not just like my books and other authors of color, but just like there has been a lot more romance in bookstores, and I think partly that so many authors of color have like had success has helped bookstores stock them, because like there are a lot of indie bookstores who sort of think of romance in one way, and they have really been thinking about it in a totally different way lately, which has been really lovely to see. And it's been just wonderful to talk to so many readers who have felt welcomed into romance, because they see, my books and books by so many other authors of color, like at Target and, in like at Barnes and Noble and in big bookstores and in places like that. So it's been like a great experience. I mean, I will say, like, because I was a lawyer for a while, the lessons that you learn when you're like one of the few Black women at a law firm is the same when you're one of the few Black women, like in in publishing, like that at your publishing house, when you're like one of the only people in a room, you know how to deal with it. So like that has been helpful for me because I came into this a little bit older. Because I had those experiences in my 20s at a law firm. And so I think some of that, like, it's the same everywhere. So your experiences, like being an author of color somewhere, are the same as being a person of color anywhere else.
That's great. Well, we can wrap up, but just a few final thoughts. Jasmine, do you have advice for people polishing a manuscript now before submitting?
Yeah, I think, take your time with it. I think that is the biggest adjustment that comes from being a person just writing a book and being a person with deadlines, is that like when you're just writing a book, you have all the time in the world. So take it, like take all the time in your world. There are no hard and fast deadlines to any of this before. I mean, deadlines are a little flexible anyway, let's be clear, but before you have a deadline in a contract, like let yourself have time. I mean, figure out, it's helpful to like figure out what your writing style is, what your working style is, and what works for you. But also don't make yourself rush. Don't think that like I have to submit by the end of the year or by this date or because I know so many people who like put themselves in that, and you can release yourself from that. It's 2020. There's no sense of time. Like let yourself like throw yourself into it, but don't like force stress on yourself when you don't need to, because this has been a stressful year enough as it is. And also, I mean, I think one of the things that I have tried to hold on to my entire publishing career is like, I remember when I first, one of the things that we didn't really go into is like all of the things in publishing that happen like between turning your manuscript in and like between it being published. But there's like a point at which sort of the last time you have to change a book is when you get pass pages from your publisher, which are like formatted as a PDF. And so you see it looking like a real book. That's when you have like the last time you can change anything. And I remember doing that process with The Wedding Date, my first book, and reading it and thinking, I still really love this book. And that is a moment that I've held on to because I want to feel like that for every single book. And so don't put something out into the world that you don't like. There are always moments where you hate what you're working on, don't get me wrong. Like every author has that, but I want to at the end like really love it. And so keep that love for writing and for your work, and don't like force things on it that you like think you have to put in or you're putting in because someone told you that. Like no, like make it your own.
Cindy and Holly, can you tell us about your wish lists or forecasts for what you'd like to see in the next year or so?
Gosh.
My hot take, here's the hot take, for this year has been everything's on fire, write what makes you happy. And that has really brought me so many amazing things from my existing clients. Like this is the time for big swings. This is the time for weird. Like if it's all gonna go up in flames, you might as well go out like going big. So I have been encouraging people to write that weird genre blend, give me something unexpected and joyful. And I don't anticipate that that will change for me. I think I will still want unexpected joy at every possible chance going into the new year. And I'm a very game reader. That is like the North Star of my like agenting philosophy. Like I will go where you want to take me. So it really is about the delight and the discovery for me. So surprising, joyful.
I will say something that I'm sure a lot of readers don't want to hear, which is stop chasing trends.
Mm-hmm.
You really need to write something that you as a writer are invested in and not try to emulate what you think will be successful. Because if it sounds like a copy of someone else's, I guarantee you most publishers will give it a pass, because what they want is to cultivate, authentic voices. So, I mean, obviously, it's going to sound contradictory, but be aware of, yes, be aware of what's going on and in terms of what is selling and what's doing well, but don't let that dictate what you write, because ultimately you're the one who has to be happy with what you write too. If, in terms of whether you decide, you landed with a traditional publisher or you decide to self-publish it, whatever happens, it's going to be your book. So you really should follow your vision, so it's corny but true.
That's wonderful. That's all great advice. Finally, I will say, please buy Party of Two and a whole sack full of books from your local bookstore. They could really use it. And thank you, Jasmine, Holly, and Cindy for joining us. Thanks to everyone who watched. And I highly recommend checking out the Authors Guild website, or you can go to YouTube and look for Authors Guild, because this is one in a series, and we've highlighted books from other genres, some with editors, some with agents, and different marketing people involved. So there's a lot of great content in each one of these. But this was fantastic. This was a lot of great info. So thank you. Thank you from everyone at the Authors Guild.
Thank you all so much for having me.
This was fun. Thank you. And thank you, Johnny.
Thanks.